Hello and welcome to the 50th episode of The New Frontier. Super exciting milestone, and thank you all for listening and being part of the journey and continuing to give us feedback. Super grateful for it. And we have a super special guest joining us for this 50th episode. He is someone who has been an incredible mentor to me personally throughout our early days of e-content, and I'm excited to kind of have him on the podcast and share his wisdom with everyone here listening. So Rael started his career in private equity, but he soon realized he would have more fun building companies, and I guess we'll see if that still holds true with all of the experience he's gone through. He has built and sold multiple businesses, including most recently Nozzle, which started in 2018 with a mission to both simplify and maximize profits and advertising investments returns for brands on Amazon. And before we bring him out, I want to mention this episode is brought to you by eContent, and we help you to optimize for AI-powered search. And go check out our latest feature, which we launched last week, on helping you see the Rufus questions on your product listings and answer them in one click. But without further ado, Rael, let's bring you out. How are you?
All good. Thanks so much for having me, and very kind words.
Yeah, no, I've been excited. I mean, it's true. I've been very excited to make this episode happen, because I remember I'm not sure how we first connected, but we first connected basically 3 or 4 weeks after I started eContent.
Right at the beginning. That's amazing.
It was so early. And because I remember we started it on this like entrepreneurship program, and I remember our first meeting was in the building where we were when we were still working there. So it would have been in the first weeks, and we stayed in contact.
It's always the best time to just chat with someone. It's like literally sort of as close to day zero as possible, right?
Yeah. But excited to talk to you today about I think I call this start, scaling, and selling a software business. And I think you know a lot about that. So I guess maybe we can start it at the beginning for you. Like, how did you come up with the idea for Nozzle, and how do you think broadly about ideation for a software business?
Yeah, I think probably to talk about Nozzle, which is the sort of Amazon-focused business, probably its roots are actually in my previous business, so probably worth starting there. There was a company called Media Gamma. This is 2013, I want to say, so 2013, 14, somewhere around there. And this was a company that's focused on what's called programmatic advertising. So nothing to do with Amazon, just sort of, general advertising across the web. And this is a world where algorithms in real time are buying and selling ad space, right, via auctions. And I don't come from, I guess, the advertising world or the, any of that stuff. As you mentioned, I come from the finance world. But what I do know, and the idea was, the finance world had been doing buying and selling stuff via algorithms in real time for decades. And so there was actually quite interesting parallels around how you could apply some of those, like the infrastructure or the financial techniques. Don't want to get into too much detail unless you want to, but could we apply this in the advertising world? And the initial idea was some financial instruments around futures and options and all these sorts of things. And I found somebody else looking into the exact same thing, which was a computer science professor at UCL, University College London, who'd written a whole bunch of papers. So long story short is that we wanted to see if we could transfer some of these ideas into the advertising world. Turned out that was not such a great idea after founding a company called Media Gamma. But what we did do is focus on just the algorithmic side. And so we would have much better buying or selling algorithms in these auctions. And so we would have, let's say, large mobile gaming companies that were interested in, showing an ad, getting someone to download their app, and obviously spend money ultimately, I guess. And we were just much better at doing that via like customized algorithms than anybody else. And one of the most important things that differentiated them, which enabled us to do our job a lot better, was this idea of we're not stopping at an app download. Like, here's what the lifetime value looks like, right? Like, it takes them 3 days to spend some money, and then 10 days and 6 months, or tracking that whole trajectory, so that we could go build better algorithms. And so when I sold that business, kind of 18, I think it was, somewhere on there. It was almost variation on the theme, which is was looking at the Amazon world to say, like, actually, is there something transferable here around this whole lifetime value idea? And the Amazon ecosystem is pretty sophisticated in some areas, but at least in this LTV, it was definitely a gap, right? And so this was really interesting, where we could have the actual data to go construct a very, very important metric that certain types of brands would value very highly, and kind of run their business according to this sort of metric. So the ideation part, to answer, is a very long-winded way of answering your question. The ideation part was sort of germinated in the previous business, but I think, like, to answer your question more broadly around ideation in general, is that I think what's very, very underrated is this idea of taking ideas or methods that have worked in other domains, and then sort of seeing whether you can transfer them, right? And so there's, like, what we did in the beginning here is to say, in the finance world, there's sort of quite a lot of precedent here. It might translate, it might not translate, or certain things might translate, but let's sort of go investigate that, right? And so getting and kind of also go, like, I think generalists in general, but are kind of underestimated, right? Like, having that expertise. And so I've never placed a really massive emphasis on, hiring, and maybe we can talk about that later. Like, having specific domain expertise, right? Like, in some cases it's useful, and you need to have perhaps a balance in the overall team. But bringing sort of fresh ideas, fresh perspectives from other industries and domains is massively underrated.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because a lot of people, when you ask them how they form the business, it will be some variation of, oh, I was experiencing this pain,
yeah,
and I didn't find a solution anywhere, so now I'm going to go off and build it. And that's kind of maybe the most standard kind of path of creating something. But I haven't really come across this so much, where you go, okay, this is like a domain expertise that I have, and now I'm going to go and pick a different, like a completely new industry, and try and put that into there.
Yeah, it's a non-traditional route. It's maybe lower probability, I guess, in the bigger scheme of things. But there are two routes to kind of get to the same thing, which is customer empathy, like really understanding their pain point. And so, you can understand that pain point because you've personally lived it, I guess, or to some degree, or some portion of it.
Yeah.
But there are other ways to get there, right? Like, I will always be an enormous advocate of basically customer empathy is probably the most important skill set in building products. And so, setting yourself up to do that, where you might have some ideas around how you can solve certain things, but really distancing yourself from the emotional side, or being very passionate. I'm a very passionate person, but you've got to channel that passion properly, right? You've got to establish that customer sort of pain point and empathy, and we can chat about how you want to do that. But you've got to establish that first and be pretty objective about it. But ultimately, you've got to be passionate about finding the solution to a customer problem, not the actual problem and solution itself necessarily. And so, yeah, just different ways to get there, I think.
So if you start with this process of, I have an edge, or like a unique insight in X, and therefore I'm going to find industry Y and apply it. Do you, just playing like devil's advocate, like, I'm just asking the question, how do you then get to understand the customer? Because by default of that approach, maybe you're saying that you don't know that customer as well. What you know really well is your solution, your new technology, the new process, whatever.
Sure.
Like, how do you then learn an industry that you're going to go and apply that in?
Learning the industry, to answer the last part of that first, learning the industry, there's no substitute for curiosity and grit, right? At the end of the day, you've got to just, it's up to you to surround yourself with all sorts, and it's easier than ever right now, I guess, sort of getting up to speed. But you need to, you can do maybe quite a bit of it quite quickly, like yourself online, but there's no substitute for talking to people and, in the industry, not even customers, just people who've been around and all that. But, you might have a sense of like the problem space, like a very wide area of problems or solutions, but certainly not wedded to any one of them. And you've got to like be really honest with yourself around a solution in search of a problem, or there's a better way to do things. Like, I've never ever hold a very strong conviction about the way which you would go and solve a problem, but I think in general this technology should be able to help in some way. That's the hypothesis, I guess, and then it's your kind of job to figure out Is this like a hair on fire problem for certain types of people, et cetera, et cetera. And like, I mean, I've gone through, I mean, ideas are the easy part, frankly, right? Like I've gone through loads of ideas, and there's, you throw away 99.9% of them. So like, absolutely.
I definitely agree with you there. Like ideas are the easy part. Execution is definitely the challenging bit. So, okay, so you have this kind of thesis about like LTV, and you kind of, I kind of half agree with you, which is, I think it is relatively easy to get to know an industry. I mean, if you just sign up to 10 events in the industry or 5 events in the industry, you would pretty quickly you could understand the lay of the land pretty quickly. Whereas maybe arguably you could say having some unique expertise and insight,
Sure,
like you did, that takes years to build, where you could go and
agree.
learn.
But you would also, I mean, I'm not building any of these companies like solo, right? I mean, there's an opportunity to build teams and co-founders and the rest of it, right? So like, it's important that, as I said, you need a sort of balance between that. And so sure, somebody else with that kind of domain expertise or experience is going to be super helpful. But I think also what's interesting to me is like, you can get up to speed pretty quickly, but you're almost presented with a consensus view, right? Pretty early on. And so what you really want to understand is like, I'm not really interested in, I mean, it's good to know the consensus view, but it's not the thing that interests me most. And it's almost like, we'll get onto this, I'm sure, a little bit later, but if you're using any of the LLMs, they're pretty good at presenting consensus views, unless you know how to prompt properly. So, if you're going to get up to speed by doing sort of vague prompting, you're going to understand that very well, but it's not going to really help you build anything differentiated, right? So like, you need to quite quickly get a hold, like understand that consensus view, and then find the, I guess, more interesting rabbit holes to go around and find the people who know a lot about those rabbit holes.
So you had the idea for Nozzle, which was basically kind of taking your experience from the other previous business. Did that idea like stay true throughout the whole time, or did it shift around?
No, it's strong conviction, loosely held kind of thing, I guess. Like, look, the central idea of like LTV is lifetime value is something pretty valuable for a certain subset of brands on Amazon. I suppose that's held quite consistently over time, right? And it's probably something only in the last maybe 6 months or so that Amazon's starting to release some data. But I mean, I can chat about that as well. But like, for a long period of time, it's nobody could really do this, or if they did it, they weren't sure if they're doing it correctly. Like, it's a pain point. But like, you'll go to market and the monetization and how do you capture sort of the value that you're creating, the actions. Like I've always said about LTV, it's an output metric, right? Lifetime value is the result of all the other inputs and stuff that you're doing right or wrong in the business. So quoting somebody a specific number is nice, but you're not helping them really to improve their business if they don't know what to do about it or how to move it, right? So you quite quickly get into like those sort of discussions and features and roadmaps around what are the most important levers to pull to move in a certain direction or whatever that is. And so like that shifts around daily in the beginning.
So I'm going to come back to that question at that point with Amazon, because it's really interesting. But just to go with the story, so you have this hypothesis. How did you start the initial customer discovery then? Like what were those initial conversations look like to see if that was actually a pain that people cared about?
Yeah, I mean, so some of it is just naturally thinking about like what sort of brands would be interested in this. And again, you don't want to rule out everybody, but like you have a sense that, look, if you don't have repeat orders, this isn't really useful. So there's certainly certain types of products or companies we can rule out on that basis, like electronics or something, and stuff like that is probably not the most useful. But you land on, okay, CPG is probably like a core part of their business, and I say this with like good hindsight, but in the beginning you don't really know these things, which is not by design, but we noticed that a lot of the early adopters were D2C brands that were running on Amazon, right? So they're D2C native and maybe begrudgingly open up an Amazon store as it was at the time. But this was kind of the easiest sell to us because they're used to these metrics, right? Like this is, well understood in the D2C world, running a business according to lifetime value and customer acquisition cost and payback period and, all those kind of things, and thinking about churn and all those kind of things. And so, the pitch was pretty simple, which is we give you like inside parity to your DSC business, but for the Amazon channel, so you can really think about like investments and the rest of it. So that was just just sort of happened. That's not like something sort of planned, but narrowing down sort of particular like industries. So anything clearly supplements or health and beauty or food and drink and that kind of stuff. And it's like and it helped me in the early days because it allows you to go deep into like a few areas instead of just casting yourself incredibly wide and thinking like anyone can use this tool. Like there's just a natural focus point. And it's also quite good because those categories are fairly large on Amazon as well, right? And so we're not talking like we're going to max out in terms of the TAM or something like that pretty early on, because these are pretty, massive brands, massive categories, and enough of a wedge for us to kind of, get in there. So, but then, again, there's a real art to doing that customer discovery side, because it's very easy when you would know this from maybe jobs to be done, type frameworks, etc. Like how to ask the questions in a non-leading way so that you get honest answers, because people are always, for good or for worse, they're always trying to like not hurt your feelings, and you've covered this in previous podcasts and stuff, so maybe like don't have to go into too much detail here, but really trying to like let them talk as much as they can at the end of the day, and to be a good listener, I think, is probably the most important skill set there. And to not lead them into like answers like as desperate as I was for them to say something like, God, I wish we had lifetime value metrics or whatever. Like it's like how do you tell me about the last time you measured success in the business, right, or something like that. Like how does that and you start to understand how does that process work and what metrics they're using and who's bought into it, and all those sort of things. And so it's doing it more sort of in that kind of discovery, almost Socratic type way of doing it, right? And so I mean, I think that's knowing that there was enough there in the early days for that to happen. And clearly the biggest thing is someone being able to write a check, right? That's words are cheap. Getting someone to pay for it when you probably don't have anything to show, right? Like that's kind of the biggest article of faith. So we managed to do that, but we still completely over-engineered the first, I guess, iteration of it, which is you're so desperate to get your first set of customers where you kind of I wouldn't say over-promise so much, but you just give them much more than they even need, right? So like for us, we had a whole Tableau dashboard and login for the clients where they can go check all these fancy charts and whatever, where literally the first, I'd say 3 out of the first 5 customers, all they cared about was like, Rael, I don't care if you just email me or text me the value, like the LTV and the CAC.
Just tell me the number.
Yeah, just give me the freaking number, man. Because like, honestly, it's what I'll never forget that. And we were like, all these dashboards, never logged in, right? Didn't want to log in, just wanted to know what the freaking number was. And so, you could avoid like a whole bunch of stuff like that I'll totally redo things that way. But so that's kind of like, the very early days. And you kind of equated, we can talk about pricing, I suppose, as well. But we were charging a fair amount. It was probably like $800 to $1,000 a month or something like that in like those early days. It's fairly big customer as well. But you kind of mistakenly think that you have to provide all these things, right, to justify that price. Like here's like a kitchen sink of like all certain ways of slicing and dicing the data, where it's like, no, actually it turns out an LTV number is worth $1,000 to me once a month.
I want to break down all of these one by one because you covered a lot of interesting things there. So firstly, initial customer discovery, and I agree with you, the temptation, and even when we launch new product and content, I still have to stop myself from doing this. The temptation is to go, oh, I've got a great idea. Amazon sellers need to know their LTV. And you get on the call and you pitch them like, don't you wish you had LTV? We could do this. And then, as you say, the natural reaction is to be like, oh, brilliant. Especially if it's a friend of yours or it's someone who been introduced via a friend. So they're just going to be polite to you. Like, great idea. Like, this is amazing. Would love it. But you, as you say, when you're doing like trying to search for a real problem, you need them to do it. And you need them to do it without you asking, oh, what's one metric that you really miss? Because like, oh, maybe that is a good question. I don't know, but you need to do it in a way that is like, what's one metric which is LT and which next letter you really miss?
Let's play some hangman with the 3-letter.
You need to actually feel that they care about it. So you're having these conversations, and people were saying to you, you're asking, how do you, I guess, like, what metrics are you using to look at your Amazon business? And they're saying, like, we've got sales and revenue, but I wish we had LTV. Like, Amazon don't share this, is really annoying. And that was happening.
Yeah, pretty much like that. There might be a bit of prodding about how do you think about repeat sales and their impact on your business, or things like that. But you generally want to start like very, very
super high level.
High level around what metrics. How do you judge success for your business? Okay. Let's break. I don't know, profit growth or sales growth or whatever sort of mode they're in at the time, and then it's like, okay, then how do you how do you think, like, what are the drivers behind that? How do you increase your profits? And then they get into discussions about repeat versus new customers. Okay, that's interesting. So what do you know about your repeat customers on Amazon, right? Have you ever tried to look into that? And it's like, well, it turns out not much. And like it kind of evolves in that.
That's the second key thing. You also need to be looking for behavior where they've tried to do something before.
Yes, exactly.
Right? You need to be 100%. Looking at what have they tried to do and failed to do? Because if you're doing something completely new and they've never even thought of the problem, then it's a lot harder.
Yeah. So I mean, we would in the beginning, yes, absolutely, right. So like this is almost the equivalent of bottom of the funnel type customer acquisition, which is people actively trying to solve the problem but are struggling somehow or not confident in like their results, and you can help them out. Then there's, as you work your way sort of higher up the funnel into people who aren't even problem aware. Let's put it that way, right? Like we would call it problem aware in kind of marketing speak. And these are people maybe running much smaller businesses, doing $1 million or something like that on Amazon. But and they're doing very well, but they haven't and they've sort of cracked Amazon in some way because they're doing quite well. But then it's like, okay, how do I get from 1 to 10 million kind of thing? And I mean, now you got to start breaking up your growth into these separate components and pulling different levers kind of thing. So like that's kind of the educational piece and the more problem aware kind of stuff, which is a slow burner. But like when you're just starting off, you want to be solving the problems for the bottom of the funnel, people who are actively trying but failing to solve it.
So how many of those conversations did you have before you built any product?
That's a good question. Probably about, I suppose, like 10, something like that. 10, 12.
10 conversations, and people are meant to bring this up. So you're like, right, my hypothesis is right. People care about this. I mean, it's kind of an obvious thing, if you're a serious business, like you want to know that number. So then how did the first, you kind of mentioned it with the Tableau dashboards, but like how did you build that first product? Did you have pre-orders, or like how did you do that?
So I didn't do pre-orders. I mean, this is it's a B2B proposition. It's harder to do the waitlist pre-order stuff. So I mean, but I was very conscious that I needed effectively a signed contract for revenue. I mean, I wasn't fixated whether it was $200 or $1,000 depending on the site. Like that's those sort of monetization issues I sort of kicked the can down the road, but it was very important for somebody to demonstrate they were
they have to pay.
Exactly. So I wasn't fixated on the amount necessarily. But again, you get the usual things like people drop out and the rest of it. So in the beginning, and also it was a very small team to begin with, so you don't want to be running sort of 10 to 15 of these. We set them up as pilots effectively, right? And so because we wanted to like really understand the customer properly and have regular calls and feedback and time to fix things and add things and all that kind of stuff. So 10 to 15 is like, I guess, way too much. So we started off with, I think it was 3 to 5 to begin with there. And I mean, some of those, I'd like to think most of them did eventually sign up at some point. And one was an agency as well. So like there's different dynamics there. And then you're getting into discussions like, I have no idea how agency pricing works here. Like,
and then what were you selling? What was that early product? So you got the first, you've got people, they say they have the problem. Then you sign 5 pilots, you're charging them $200 to $1,000. I agree with you. As long as they're paying at this stage, it doesn't matter really. What are you giving them?
So the most valuable thing that we've always done is the cohort analysis. Again, I've realized we're, some way into this conversation. It says about 24 minutes. I haven't really described what Nozzle does properly, but anyway. It was effectively a cohort analysis and frankly, in my view, remains the most important thing. And just to like back up a little bit, what is a LTV cohort analysis? It's when you it's a way of isolating people and tracking what they do over time in the simplest form. And so what does that mean in kind of the Amazon world is you can say, okay, everybody who bought from me in December 24, let's isolate them and track what happens to them in terms of repeat orders and their profit over time, like a customer lifetime value I use interchangeably with profit over time. So people who first converted in December, how profitable are they after 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is? And you want to be comparing that to, let's say, people who first converted in November or October or whatever other sort of cohorts they get segmented into. And the reason why this is so important is if you make basically any change on Amazon, you change your price, you're doing a remarketing campaign, you're doing coupons, like anything, how do you know whether it works?
Yeah.
Well, it's not really an A/B test because an A/B test is like a fixed period of time. You kind of see what happens. The only way to figure out for brands that have a high number of repeat orders, the only way to really figure out whether these changes are working is to track people who were exposed to them, who bought on that coupon or bought again via that remarketing, whatever it is, and track what happens to them. Are they more profitable over time than your baseline? Right, and that's the cohort analysis. And so, like a lot of the big questions that this LTV cohort analysis is answering are, number one, if you know how profitable a customer is over time, you can answer the question of how much you can afford to spend to acquire a new customer, right? So that's in and of itself is an enormous thing because it's all to do with your ad budgets and how you want to split them and how focused you want to be on sort of net new versus returning. So there's a whole sort of decision tree around that. But the other thing is this idea of understanding what changes you're making are actually working and driving growth. Right. And so like this LTV and cohort stuff is the thing that we landed on, I think quite early. And as I say, to this day, I think is probably the most valuable. Like it requires quite a lot from the customer to understand what it is, how to use it, all that kind of stuff. So like, I think one of the things we've always struggled with was that education piece. And so like outside of that very early adopter of we're a D2C brand, we live and breathe this kind of stuff every day on D2C, like we know what a cohort analysis is, there's always like certainly a bit of friction on outside of that, like early adopter, right? On how to use it.
But this data isn't available in Amazon, hence why Nozzle existed. But how did you surface that to the customer? Like, in an early pilot of the tool?
Yeah, so it was a Tableau dashboard. They would grant us API access, and so we would get the data directly from Amazon via the APIs, and we would go build. You would ingest the data, you store it in a database, you write the SQL queries, and you produce it in a Tableau.
I see. So you're building. So the product is like this analysis of looking at when the purchases come through and doing like some algorithm to decide to give them like cohort analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it's algorithms probably being a little bit generous. Honestly, it's a SQL query which does the cohort analysis. So, like, we can talk about where you would add some sort of machine learning or whatever, but in the first stage, no, like it's complete overkill. Like again, it's very easy to throw a kitchen sink, but when someone wants an LTV analysis, you can do it with SQL, and so we just throw that in a Tableau dashboard. And the other thing they wanted to be tracking is the CAC, so LTV over time, CAC, and the number of new to brands. Like those are the three key metrics that people want to care about. And one of the things I think we had to think about early on is these are very slow moving metrics, at least the LTV is, meaning you probably only need to check this maybe monthly, but probably quarterly. Right. And so why should people come back? Right. Like why you sign up for a trial, get your numbers. Thanks. Maybe I'll sign up again in whatever, 6 months or something. And so what's the reason to come back and use it? And it was basically the cohort analysis was the reason to come back and use it, right? Because again, how do you measure? It's fine. You know what some baseline LTV is or CAC is, but it's the direction of travel that's important for your business, right? Like how's it shaping up quarter on quarter or something like that? So we certainly had a bunch of like signups and instant cancel sort of behavior, but really had to think about retention in our own sense.
So you build this like MVP SQL query, got the customers, and I assume everything's going well. People are liking it, they're using it. So how did you kind of like ramp up the go to market from there?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. Again, it's easy for me to say with hindsight around it, but like what we were producing effectively are proprietary data sets. So whilst the data sets were always always belong to our customer and all that kind of stuff, the aggregated data sets are interesting. Meaning,
Yep.
one of the most common questions we would get from, again, a supplement company, to pick on them, is to say, cool, I understand all the stuff around my business, around these key metrics, but actually, how do I compare?
Yeah.
Right? What is the category average here? Um, and if something's gone up or something's gone down, is it something that's happening at a category level, or is it like, to do with my business kind of thing? And so we were effectively generating pretty interesting proprietary data sets there, and being able to then benchmark performance on these metrics. So, we could say that, typically for a sort of a drink company, or whatever the sort of subcategory may be, this is kind of where you want to be, right? Like, this is what maybe average looks like. This is what 90th percentile looks like, both in terms of lifetime value growth, like after 3 months, assuming your purchase cycles are 90 days roughly, and what's going on the CAC side, right? Is it becoming just more expensive to acquire a customer in your category? So, I mean, there've been loads of metrics that are like CPC driven, which is useful but limited. What you really want to understand is how expensive it is to acquire a new customer on Amazon, and we can provide like an industry benchmark or index on these things. And so that helps with two things. Like, that helps with retention of our customer base, but it provides an incredible marketing opportunity. So you're talking, again, to go back a long way of answering your question, which is like, how do you attract more customers? How do you get your sort of marketing machine going? Is that we could release some of these like indices or category data, and then be the thought leaders in all of this stuff, right? And say, like, find out, it's a great lead magnet, which is find out what your CAC is, like, this is what it is for your category, like, sign up here and find out, kind of thing, right? So I think that was like quite a nice early, not by design, right? As I said, it's just something you kind of one day think about it and like, okay, these are interesting data sets. We can use them both for retention and marketing purposes.
Yeah, and I remember we talked about this a year and a half ago. I don't know if you remember this conversation, but we were talking about this, and it was literally like over the week after the GPT store launched, and you were kind of describing like, oh, we were doing these like PDFs and whatever. I was like, oh my god, you can just go and I should go and build a GPT of how people are doing for Cosmo, like a free thing. And it's been like, as you're saying, kind of like, if you have an area which you are an authority on, and you have some kind of proprietary data, which we do, like, chuck it into a GPT, send it out to everyone. It got in all of the newsletters, like Kevin King talked about it, like John Durden.
Amazing. Like, I remember that.
It was so new, right? Like, it was like everyone was talking, like, it was when like the GPT store hype was like at its top, and everyone's like, this is going to kill the iPhone and whatever. And like, it was a really good way of getting people to just like give them value for free and easy and cheap, and also like have a little link back to e-content at the end. Like, okay, you've got your Cosmo score for like 1 ASIN if you want to generate like all the optimized visual and written content and do it at scale. Like, here you go. So
I mean, I think my DNA is more, I guess, data driven. It's just kind of the way I look at the world, kind of thing. So I'm always looking for like data ways to to differentiate and create sort of lead magnets and stuff, right? It's just one way of doing it. But I think your app ranked quite nicely as well, or something.
We still are. We're if you type in Amazon, we're in the top 10, at least last time I checked. On the GPT score, which is great. So you built these, you've got this data, and I think this is fundamentally you're bringing value to the customers and the community and the industry, because you've got this insight. You're giving it away basically for free, but then also people understand that they can come and use Nozzle and get like their own data, and that's helpful. So kind of like, that's a broad marketing way. Like, were there any other ways that you were going to market in these, like, I don't know where we are in the story now, but like early days or medium days, is pre-raising money, right? I'm talking pre any raise. Like,
there was a raise. I don't remember the exact amount. There was, I can't remember. Was it maybe $1 million in sterling, something like that, somewhere around there? So there certainly was a raise, just because you need an engineering team.
You raised. At what point did you raise the money?
Well, it was 2020, I would say, somewhere on like maybe mid-year 2020, something like that.
So like 2 years in, basically.
Yeah, and somewhere on there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so in terms of the other sort of way to accelerate would be via agencies,
Yeah.
which is pretty complicated, I guess, because it's just a very different set of requirements and incentives, I guess, from sort of the product point of view. So we, I mean, honestly, it's only in the next like I don't know month or two that we're allowing multi-user access, which kind of
Mm-hmm.
sounds nuts in today's age. So someone's like signs up to Nozzle and says, "Hey, can we just add like another user?" We haven't really built the infrastructure for that, so it's kind of like being single player for quite a long time on that. But I think that also speaks to some of the like, knowing who your customers are and all that kind of stuff, and like trying to just make sure you provide value, more and more value to like your ICP at the end of the day,
You're
right?
saying agencies as a go-to-market because you would approach agencies and they would manage 10, 20 brands. So basically,
Yeah, so it's a quicker way to scale.
You're gonna go and sell to these agencies, and they will sell to the e-commerce brands.
Yeah, but then I think we had quite a few false starts with the agencies, right? Just because a few things. In some cases, like LTV is most valuable when you're doing a profit per customer, not sales per customer. And so we had a few instances where brands weren't giving the agencies the cost of goods sold for whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, it's not that great. But then there's also, in some cases, it could make the agency look not so great with what they're doing and stuff sort of declining. And so like, and I'd always be flexible to say, like, if you want me on the call with the client, happy to do it. Otherwise, do it on your own, like whatever, that's fine. But I think being too far removed wasn't good. And so a lot of from the customer wasn't good.
Yeah.
It's ultimately on me, right? Because I think there needed to be more training on the agency side around, again, like what are these metrics, why they're important, and like all that kind of stuff. So we certainly had a few false starts with that. We did for sure had a couple agencies that, I mean, to what we were talking about earlier, were actively trying to do this themselves. And again, weren't confident on the accuracy or the methodology and whatever. And like, that's like an easy thing. But in general, agencies, I think, have been sort of, tougher for us. Nozzle always works best when there's talking about sort of our ICP. Clearly, it has like one of these categories is really important for us, but also it's ultimately somebody with the P&L responsibility. So in smaller companies, it tends to still be kind of the founder, I guess. But in larger companies, and we work with some, enormous brands, doing 50, 80 million or something on Amazon. But it's generally somebody who's got P&L responsibility for the Amazon channel or for marketplaces or something like that, right? Because it's a strategic tool. And I think that's one of the other challenges we faced early on is it's not, at least in those days, it was quite rare to pay money for a strategic tool. And when we were searching, I should have brought this up earlier, like when we were searching for early adopters and ICPs and all that sort of stuff, we found people who valued their time over money, right? And so like even if this thing is manual and like, yeah, I just didn't want to, like, they weren't willing to, I guess, sorry, the other way around, they valued the money more, so they weren't willing to part with this, even though it can save them time or whatever. Like, it's just, so those tend to be like smaller brands, and that's fine. I could, I totally get that sort of decision, but that was something we realized quite early on, where trying to convince somebody to pay for a strategic tool, and tying the amount, like, I guess in some ways not recognizing the value. So they would say that it's far too expensive, and that's fair, right? Like, it could be that the business, if you're just starting out on Amazon, it's not the tool for you anyway, right? Like, you need to be more established to use it. So like figuring out those sort of things early on was super valuable.
This is a really interesting point, and it's a point which we've recently faced. So when you're, unless you're kind of like Sam Altman or someone of this level, and you can just like start a company and immediately you're going to be talking to all the CEOs of the top FTSE 150. I think for many of us kind of normal people, the way you start out, you do your ideation, you're talking to small companies, as you probably were, right? The founder.
Yeah,
Founder
absolutely.
really cares about LTV. Maybe you have a 10, 20 person company. And then at a certain point, you want to start to be like, okay, this is a great tool. And I know actually L'Oreal or whoever, like big shampoo brand, they're going to want to know this, or, the biggest hymns or whatever, like the big, supplements brands. This is obviously going to be useful for them. How do you go about working out like how that ICP individual transitions? Because early company is the founder, easy. And then now you're going to a big organization, so many stakeholders, how do you work out who needs a product?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think a lot of that would come from, if I'm running webinars and things like that, it's understanding who's joining those webinars. So who's the internal champion? Who's the internal champion there? Like, the buyer is not the same as the user in most B2B, software.
100%.
So like understanding that distinction where the buyer is the user for the smaller companies, right? It's the CEO that's kind of logging in and checking the LTV numbers or whatever the things are, but that splits. And so like really splitting that into who the people logging in from our tool, and I'm building sort of product for them, and how do I make them look good, and sort of help them, progress in their organization or whatever in their careers, but also being extremely mindful of like who's actually signing off on this, and like what metrics they're being used there. So understanding those, like as I said, it was like who's joining the webinars, often as well for the sort of mid-market, maybe going a little bit enterprisey type customers, we would also do services. So this is another interesting thing, which is like, let's prove the value by doing basically a consulting project, something custom to them, that will use the data, and it's something customer related or LTV related, but it's ultimately custom. And that's kind of a good way of getting in just via like a consultancy project. But it does mean that, as a sales process or sales skills, as me, I need to adapt. You talking to a very sort of different person than the rest of it. But I think like doing a service type project is often a good way in.
This is something else we've been dragged into, and it's an interesting one, which is often they will want a service or a consulting type business, but you're building a software product, and you actually you don't want to. I don't know about you, but you kind of don't want to, you want to build something that scales, that you can launch anywhere, and it's going to become hopefully $1 billion company. You don't want to start doing like consultancy, which is going to take a lot of the founder's time, and have a lot of like manual work, which doesn't necessarily scale. So how do you manage that kind of?
Yeah, I think if you ask me towards the beginning of the company, I mean, every sort of SaaS founder will almost be ideological about it. No, it's a distraction, and it doesn't help with fundraising or valuation or exits, and I don't know, all those kind of things as well, and all that kind of stuff. But I think, as you mature as a company and as a person, frankly, the more of a almost like dirty secret it is in the SaaS world, right? Like I just don't. For me, it's most SaaS company or successful SaaS companies will have a service component to it, and as long as it's very related to the stuff that you're doing. Like for us, it's always something to do with the core cohort analysis that we're doing. Then I think it's great. It's a way of like strengthening you're growing the LTV, frankly, of our own customer base, and strengthening the bonds. And when these people in these organizations, your sponsor in that organization moves on into another company, like the amount of like calls I've gotten saying like, cool, let's do this for this new company that I'm at. And having those personal relationships has been massive for me. So as long as it doesn't veer too far away from what you're doing, and honestly, it's helped us refine the product as well, right? So like we're getting almost in some ways paid to test out new product features and the rest of it. So
as a percentage, I don't know, it's fine. I know that the business has been acquired, so you can't really talk about some stuff. But as a percentage of revenue, if you can answer, what percentage was coming from like enterprise services, and what is coming from like people just signing up and using it as like a pure SaaS?
Yeah, the majority is still going to be on the SaaS side. Sure.
Okay.
So
you've got some big contracts.
It was always in the majority, and most of the time it always started off as a SaaS product, and then layering on service stuff, right? So for the larger customers, There's a bit of a different onboarding process. So like I would reach out to them, I'd have a call with them, like all that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And I'd let it be known right in the beginning that we do offer services. It's not really on the website kind of thing, but let's do that. And then I would check in with them every, I don't know, 6 months.
So
And
services
that, right?
being, we'll build an analysis, present this to you with some like specific ideas for your specific company. And
Yeah,
we
often it comes from them though, right? So like often it's, so one of the, like two common things we would do would be forecasting.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get in, well, if you want me to, I can, but like there's a pretty unique approach to forecasting you can have for businesses that have repeat orders, meaning you can use those cohorts. You project out every individual cohort based on the retention rate and the LTV and whatever, all that kind of stuff. So you can actually do very neat type forecasts off the back of that. Very difficult to productize forecasts, right? Like ultimately all forecasts land up in a spreadsheet again.
Yeah.
And everyone's got kind of the unique requirements. So it's like very hard to like standard, like you can have a template, I guess, but it's very hard to like completely sass it.
Makes sense.
So like, but it was super valuable, right? These forecasts are massive, right? Like it's basically, it's like this is like board level stuff.
Well, it's like another product. I mean, in a sense, it's like that is a product in itself, right? Obviously, it's a custom built one.
Sure.
Okay, so at some point, you're doing all this stuff. You're selling to agencies. You're doing some services to big customers. At some point, you raise the venture money. Why did you decide to raise it? And
that's a very good question, and I think it's like a very timely one, just because I think the environment is so different now, right? But like, drinking, I guess, the SaaS Kool-Aid and all that sort of stuff. Look, I do certainly think that the very traditional SaaS, business model is to a lot of like upfront development, right? Costly development, but then your marginal cost to serve an incremental customer is near zero kind of thing. And so it's like kind of a classic route like that. But I would say, it's very hard to get off the VC train if you've decided to go on the VC train. And so it's kind of a one-way door in that sense.
Yeah.
Like if you make the decision that you're going to raise venture capital money, there are
you're
irreversible. It's like you're on a particular path, and it's maybe not binary, but not many paths. And so it's a very careful consideration that you need to make. I still think it was the right decision for Nozzle. I have no regrets about all of that sort of stuff, but I think in today's environment, there are probably like many other ways to kind of get going. But yeah.
So you raise the money on like just getting an understanding of timelines on an MVP, or like you're making can you like roughly?
Yeah. So we had committed. We didn't have the product. I think it was like letters of intent.
Got it. So you raised $1 million pre-product and everything.
Yeah, and it's like in the UK as well, you've got those SEIS and EIS sort of things as well. So
we love that.
We also this may or may not be the case. I might be misremembering, but we had R&D tax credits as well. So there's like another thing on the tax side, which is for those who don't know, you have a specific, again, it's like quite a, I guess, stringent like application process, but you have a particular project and some of it can get funded by the government effectively. So if you couple those two things around, if the proposition to an investor or like an SEIS or EIS investor is for every pound you put in is being matched by the government, and for downside protection, you can get, what is it? I don't know, 80% of your money back if, that's pretty appealing proposition.
Of course, it's an easy, you'd be mad not to.
Make it easy for investors. Look, I know there's been quite maybe of late, a little bit more criticism on the EIS and the SEIS sort of incentives, and are the government better off doing other things? But that's a whole nother discussion.
Well, I mean, it's a different discussion. I think it's one of the best things that the government does, and a lot of the other stuff is a waste of time, to be honest. But that's my personal view. Okay, so you raise the money, and then you're hiring the team. Do you want to talk about how you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, this is always sort of an engineering heavy thing, right? And so like understanding the Amazon data sets and the APIs were not good at that stage. It was what's it called? Is it the MWS? I think it was called before the selling partner. So like documentation is not great. Things don't work as expected. And things take longer to build as a result. And so there's a lot of like back and forth around all of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, hiring, the data engineer and sort of engineering and SQL skills, that kind of, and clearly we're building a dashboard. So now we're moving to like a web app, right? No longer Tableau. And so there's, front-end skills that are needed there. So like, hiring hiring that team. There's marketing that needs to be done. So all those sort of things. And I think like one thing to maybe call out is thinking about the relationship between machine learning and engineering, right? And so I think that I sort of put them on like a horizontally, they're kind of the same, right? They're just different functions, but like that kind of thing. But ultimately, the machine learning stuff has to fit into an engineering framework. At the end of the day, you're deploying something like an app in a production environment here, and so you can do all these fancy things with algorithms and machine learning, but at the end of the day, like it's still subject to engineering constraints, right? And so thinking, for me, I think wasted quite a lot of time on maybe some of the machine learning stuff a little bit too early. Once you got to have pretty good data infrastructure and machine learning like operations kind of infrastructure in place before you go and hire data scientists. So like I think with hindsight, some of the sequencing I think was definitely out, and which is super valuable when you're a very early stage company and runway matters.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one thing I'd do differently.
I missed a point which I wanted to come back to, and I made a note of it. Like, you're raising money, rewriting the story, and this is what you said about Amazon doing it. And now, like, the number one question that I think you get as an entrepreneur when you're raising money, and it's a very infuriating question, is like, oh, but Google could just do this, or Meta could just do this, or Amazon could just do this. It's like, well, yeah, they can do anything, right?
Yeah.
Of course they could do, like, anyone could do this. You just need to start, right? There's not like you need an engineer, data scientist, do anything. So, but how did you like in those conversations and even in your own strategy think about the risk of like Amazon doing what your business is?
Yeah, so there's two things there, two existential risks. The first is like Amazon basically doing what you're doing. The second is API related. Like even if they're not doing what you're doing, they can just they make a change to the API, or they switch it off, or do something, and then you're screwed. So like those are the two big things. On the second one, which is the API one, we were pretty convinced that at least that wasn't going to happen to the short and medium term, right? On the API, if anything, they were like investing a hell of a lot more into the APIs. The ad business is starting to take off, and Amazon's DNA is not an advertising business, right? They're not Google or Facebook in that sense. And Amazon's DNA, similar to like AWS, which is here, like we're good at the infrastructure side of it. So here's like some infrastructure, and we don't really know how to do ads all that well, and so we need help on that side. And so we're going to invest in APIs and partners, etc., to go and grow us, grow that sort of part out. And I think that's still largely held true. I mean, the ad business is flying. It's like that is number one and number two in terms of profitability for Amazon as an entire business. So I think like that bet was absolutely justified and fine. And at the end of the day, sure, every single investor asked that, but I don't know if that was a showstopper.
It's an investor question, and I kind of like I care less about it as an investor question almost as much as a strategy question, because at the end of the day, you want to sell your business. You did sell your business. Like you don't want to build a business which then gets basically all the values just destroyed in the business.
So the other thing is like, what if Amazon starts doing LTV stuff?
Exactly.
And then so for me, it's always Amazon's been good on the infrastructure, or eventually good on the infrastructure, let's say, and they can provide some metrics. What they're not good at is telling you what the hell to do with the metrics. Right? And so like if we're building all the context and the decision tree that you need to go through on how to move this, this metric, that's a valuable thing. And Amazon's never going to be able to copy that. Like you just, spend 10 minutes in Seller Central, Vendor Central or something, and you just, you'll know that pretty quickly. Right. And so like the moat there for sure, moat in terms of like Amazon copying it kind of thing is not on like the metric itself. It's here's the metric and here's what you need to do about it. And so like, again, I think that's pretty, that's like an hypothesis that's held true, and I think still will hold true for some amount of time. Like people, it's the same sort of people that were like, would sign up to Nozzle, get an LTV metric, and then just cancel on the first day sort of thing, cool. Like it's sort of the same, people would just go into vendors. So I don't think we were losing out on customers because those are the same people that are going to Seller Central, get an LTV metric, and then carry on, right? So like understanding what decisions can you make? What's the most, like, for instance, for driving new to brands, is it coupons or ads that does a better job of like, net customer acquisition or retention or all that kind of stuff to move the metric, and what's the relationship between those things in LTV. So there's that. The other thing I do want to add though is like, what happens if there's a change on the API, because this actually happened to us, right? And so we and this one's much harder to manage, and it was pretty existential to us, which is we like wake up one day and we just can't onboard any customers. Literally, like, just errors all around. And it took us the best part of like 4 to 6 weeks to resolve this with Amazon.
Wow.
And when you're an early stage company, and I can't remember what was the exact issue. It was honestly something so stupid and trivial. But the problem is, Amazon is like so siloed and it's so niche as well. Like it's, I don't know, probably some person in a basement somewhere that knows the answer in Amazon, right? Like what the hell the issue is. And so that hurt us massively. Not like, thankfully, I think we didn't lose most of the customers. They eventually, signed up. But the problem is the runway part of it. We lost out on revenue that reduced our runway by 1 or 2 months. And then you're just super stressing, right? Like on that side of it. So like that is the more material side. How do you mitigate something like that? Well, that's extremely difficult, right? Like that is, you need to, like, I would like to think we have pretty good contacts, like API contacts within Amazon, that we can, escalate things and whatever. But again, those people move on, and then what do you do? And we're not in Seattle. I can't go like, although I probably should have flown to Seattle at that point. But so like that is a much harder one to manage, and that's like a absolute material risk if something happens there.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're building this beautiful company, you're growing the revenue, and at some point you sell the company. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of that side of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's also the decision to sell is related to basically trying to give Nozzle the best chance to succeed. And what do I mean by that, right? Like, how do we access larger customers, enterprise customers, the level of investment that's needed in the product, so you could go out and raise some money. And it wasn't a great like funding environment as well. What is this in 22? I want to say 23, maybe 23. Sorry. Well, it's the end of 22, 23. Not a particularly great, funding environment over here.
So you basically needed more capital in the business
for what I thought we needed to do, right? And so like to really grow Nozzle, to make it multi-channel, right? So like go beyond Amazon. We never wanted to, and we still don't want to become like an actual bid management platform, but a lot of the actions clearly from Nozzle are going to be on the advertising side, right? So how do you acquire new customers? Obviously the main lever on Amazon is going to be on ads. But so we didn't want to do bid management, but we clearly needed a lot more investment on like the advertising side to be a lot more prescriptive around what we think you should do to decrease your CAC or whatever the thing is. So for me, it's like, how do you set yourself up to succeed, both from growing the revenue, easier access to customers and things like that, and then just like level of investment on, let's say, on the product side, allowing us to be multi-channel. And so Nozzle's found a great home in Optimize On, accessing the customers who are multi-channel there, and also like access the product development's interesting as well, because it's not only is it the sort of Nozzle customer base, but it's the people within Optimize On who are using Nozzle as well that I can tap into, right? That are they're using Nozzle. So it's, what are the insights there? What are the challenges? So like that whole product cycle, the feedback and development, all that kind of stuff can happen a lot quicker too.
How big is Optimize On? Do you, like, in terms of headcount or whatever you can share?
It's about over 40 people now.
Okay. So cool. So and how do you manage? So you had a team of like 9, you said before we recorded.
Yes, maybe a little bit more, but yes, I'm around there for sure.
Okay. So you had so basically, you're integrating 25% roughly of the the purchasing business. Like how do you manage like an integration as a founder between your team and the new company?
Yeah, it's you've got to be culturally aligned beforehand, right? Like managing any sort of like M&A process is, for me at least, and the other ways to go about it. You can be super transactional about it, I guess, but understanding like, do you really click with the founders or the people you'll be working with is like just, I think, a really huge part of that. You've got to.
Did you know them before, or did you only come across?
No,
them?
we were introduced by sort of a mutual acquaintance. Yeah. But James has been great, and clicked very early on. And it does sound maybe cliche to say, but things like the values and all that kind of stuff like really does sort of play a pretty big part. But you also face a challenge where you're a SaaS company and a technology company and a, like, very skewed skill set, let's say, into like effectively an agency business, right? And so like that's a very different DNA of the business, and so there's definitely challenges around all those sort of things, right? So like look, I suppose I'd been used to educating or training people on how to think about these metrics. If you've never heard of them before and all that kind of stuff, that's fine. But an account manager or something's got like lots of other responsibilities as well, right? You're not like the center of their lives sort of thing anymore. Not that we were ever for some of these brands, but so like thinking about these, trying to like upfront think of these things and how they would be handled. But until you living through it, then I think it's you don't ever know. And I think a lot of the processes have a very high probability. Sorry, integrations have a very high probability of going south very quickly. Thankfully, hasn't been the case. And to be fair, like also with James, Optimizing's left Nozzle to be pretty independent. So it's not, you can sign up to Nozzle. You don't have to be an Optimizing customer to sign up to Nozzle, kind of thing. So we kind of left our own devices in that way.
And like, in terms of your role, are you basically CEO of Optimizing within this broader picture now, or do you also take on stuff within the agency, or how does that
so obviously heading all the Nozzle stuff still, but also within the wider agency, sort of technology deployments and things like that, right? So there could be the agency
introduced us to Optimizing, so for example.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of like needs and constraints and stuff within the agency. And so understanding like what's build versus buy decisions within the agency, how to really like be tech, like differentiated with technology. So like the stuff you really want to build, you need to make sure that like that fits into a very specific like Optimizing philosophy way of doing things. Cool. So like I don't want to go replicate other like really good like SaaS software for Amazon agencies. I probably want to use them as a starting point and then build on the top of that for like specific workflows and things like that. So it's a very different way of thinking about things. It's kind of new to me, I guess, in that sense. But it's been great.
And have they made other acquisitions in the tech space, or is it like
not in the tech space? Other agencies, yes, but not not in. So we're kind of I guess the first and only to date, I should say, tech acquisition.
But they've done other agencies, so they kind of knew from their side they do.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that was a super interesting kind of whistle stop tour of all of it. Like, so a few final questions, if it's okay. So number one, like, you kind of hinted at a few things you would have done differently throughout the discussion, but like on reflection, on the whole journey, what like key lessons or things would you take away?
I think in the early days, the hiring side is still probably the most important thing, and there are still it's funny because like as a founder, everybody will tell you hiring is probably the most difficult thing, but it's also the most important thing. And you probably know early when it's not working out, so it's best to part ways early. And so having read that 10 times, I still didn't do it. Meaning I kind of knew it wasn't working out with certain like senior people, but didn't do anything about it. And that's
how do you know if it's working or it's not working?
I think you get a sense it depends on the role. So like a sales role is probably a little bit easier.
That's the thing, right? In sales or in tech, like they're either delivering or they're not. And it's it's really transparent. We have a 2-week sprint cycle on the tech side. If someone isn't building what they're supposed to build in 2 weeks, my co-founder, who's a CTO, obviously feels like it's a reasonable thing that could be built. Right? But like in some other roles, let's say customer success or I don't know, like in other places, it's harder to know, or marketing maybe, like,
Yeah,
it's not, it's hard to judge early
It,
on.
it is very hard to judge. I mean, I think like on the marketing side, it was always about prioritizing experiments and having a similar company-wide attitude of like, you've got an hypothesis, you go test it, that like that sort of thing. And so I need you to be running, I don't know, 3 experiments a week, kind of thing. But also just the general, I don't know, problem solving attitude or new ideas on certain things. Like you can just tell pretty early whether you're gelling. But then as I said, I probably hesitated far too long on a few of those hires, just keep on giving the benefit of the doubt, where I think you just kind of know, right? And
You got to follow your gut, you're saying.
yeah, I should have. And the gut's always been something like very mysterious to me, being very, I don't know, data oriented and the rest of it. I'm always like, what is this thing called gut? But it's something I think I've learned over the past, past few years of like how to tap into it, right? I think so. So like the hiring side is definitely one thing. The funding side is interesting because today's environment is just so different, meaning a lot more can be accomplished earlier on, given a lot of the sort of tooling that's out there. Right?
This is a question on how does AI change all of this?
So
right?
It's a big part. It's absolutely a big part of it, right? So it's absolutely a big part of it. Meaning, look, because all the tooling's there and all these, I guess, possibilities now, expectations are also higher. So it's a little bit, it's just because these things are out there, like expectations from like, let's say, customers and investors. Before, it used to be maybe like $1 million run rate or something in revenue before, you used to have these heuristics, right? The revenue run rate before you could raise a particular round or, something like that. But now with all this tooling, on the one hand, it makes it easier, but on the other hand, it's kind of like, well, that million's no longer $1 million, it's 2 million or in run rate. So, it just kind of corrects quickly. But yes, I mean, it's just so fundamentally different now, meaning I'm not I don't write code, right? I can do like SQL, basic SQL stuff, but I'm not like, production engineering or anything like that. But there are incredible tools now to get working more than a prototype, like a very basic working product out there that you can charge money for without hiring any engineer, right? So using tools like Lovable or Cursor in some cases, which is an IDE. You just got like
or ChatGPT, right? You could build a product.
Yeah. The ChatGPT is difficult because it doesn't have like a database and all that. Like if you're building a SaaS tool, you need
but you can build an MVP.
But you can
do a website and
you can do the website stuff. But like in terms of like taking a Stripe payment,
fair enough,
all that kind of. But I'm saying it's not that difficult. Like you could, you could easily like I'm doing, and I had so much fun over the December holidays, just like doing some hobby sort of apps. But it's got a server and it's got a database and it's got a front end, and they're saying like the best programming language to learn these days is English, right? Because you learn good prompting and you can do these things. It's remarkable. So you can get a lot more further down the road before thinking about, funding and all that. I definitely think the business models are probably like the one area where you have an enormous ability to disrupt and take on SaaS companies. So, I mean, SaaS is like either a per seat model or something like that, but it's always so a human can go and do the task at hand. We're enabling and empowering a human to go and do this thing, and we're going to charge you per seat or whatever it is. The agent stuff is like super, super interesting. It's actually doing the task instead of the human. And so, some of the like, I don't know, more tasks on like say customer success and stuff like that. You've had like Intercom, was it Intercom, I think, come out and say that, their agents are solving like some enormous amount of of queries there and just cut down their half the team of the humans or that kind of thing. So being able to like change the business model and charge on a completely different like vector to what a SaaS company does, that is very, very difficult for an incumbent to respond to, right? And so like you've got an amazing opportunity to say, is there a different business model here that can really change something? What's not clear to me though, and it's like super interesting, is to understand where the moats are if you're building an AI-based business. Because people would naturally, I mean, I don't know if you've got thoughts on this, because it's obviously something you probably get asked about a lot as well, right? It's like, it's all like, is it in the models? Is it in the data? Is it?
I love this question, because when we first started raising, like when we first launched Twitch Dollar Raise Money, everyone was saying, oh, like, this is a thin. It wasn't a thin layer, but people would say, oh, this is a thin wrapper on top of ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion. Anyone can build a image generation and then a text generation tool, and and the people who are going to make money are the model builders. And kind of fast forward 3 years, what's actually happened is the wrappers, so to speak, like Perplexity, where you have a brand and it's a recognized, people come to it and you have a recognizable brand and you can charge people to use the product. That's where the values are queuing, and actually the models you can swap out. And it doesn't matter if I'm using R1 or O1 or Claude 3.5. Like models are interchangeable, and actually that's being commoditized. So
hundreds of billions of dollars later, it turns out.
Exactly. So I think the application layer, which is where we sit. I mean, I hope, as you say, the agentic and the application layer. That's where you have the relationship with the customer. You can charge them, as we try to, a human fee. Like, how much would a human cost to do this? Well, eContent's going to do like 100x in a human. So give us the same, hire one eContent, and we're gonna So let's see how it all shakes up. But I think the kind of like the thinking of this has really shifted, in my view, anyway.
And it's probably going to shift again, honestly, because it's just like it's definitely not at equilibrium anywhere close to that. And like what's super interesting to me is now a little bit in the weeds, but like it's about the cost of inference. So traditionally with with SaaS is you have all those upfront costs, but the marginal cost to serve like a customer is pretty close to zero. But now that's changing, because now all of a sudden,
expensive.
So now it's like almost the opposite, which is it's actually becoming expensive again to serve an incremental customer.
Which is why NVIDIA is the most valuable company.
Absolutely. And so again, thinking about that, like, is that a good or a bad thing? How does that feed into the business models? Like, especially if you're up against a SaaS company. So like all these sort of things. And then the other part of it is on the data side. Like if you have access to, I don't know, private data sets or something, like the data argument has always been very, I remember like 10, 15 years ago, even with the previous companies, there's always like, oh, but it's proprietary data sets, that's a differentiator, and da. But actually they're getting pretty good at making synthetic data sets to train models. And so thinking about like, is it the cost of inference? Is it like the data sets? And then also the model building, right? Like you don't need, at least to begin with, let's say, you don't need a super expensive, machine learning scientists to go and build a custom tuned model. Like you can literally feed inputs and outputs into Gemini or like one of these models, and it figures out the relationship and everything in between, right? You don't need to know that it's using this method and this is It's helpful, but at least to like prove something out in the beginning stages, you can, honestly, I've done it, right? Like I've fed these things into these models. You don't necessarily need to know everything under the hood there. So again, it's just interesting for me to think about like, where
do you think it's easier than ever to start a company, to start a software company?
Well, it's easier than ever, but it's it's enormously competitive. What I love about it, at least from like a consumer point of view, especially on like the ability to like build these tools quite easily now, like I was doing over the holidays, like I said to you, is it's not, producing an app is not just the domain of like some software engineer, right? Like someone who has no coding experience can go test ideas over a weekend. And that for me is just incredible. That's absolutely insane. And so like a very, very bright future, competitive in the rest of it. Absolutely. But just what I think
it's exciting. And I kind of feel that things like you won't have in the future, like these massive companies kind of dominating everything. I think my hope is anyway, that the barriers to entry for entrepreneurship is severely lowered. As you say, you can be an individual person with no coding experience and build something amazing, probably even raise money. Like if people are using it, people love it, then you raise money, build something proper. And therefore, hopefully there'll be lots more entrepreneurs and there will be a lot more competition. But at the end of the day, fragmented marketplaces, and you won't just have like one Amazon, you'll have like many different places that you can, like in search, for example, you have Perplexity, you have ChatGPT, you have Google, you'll have you have, like things will start to become hopefully more fragmented and specialized. And I think that's a good thing for society.
It's interesting. It's like, to what extent does scale matter still? But yeah, I mean, I don't have the answers. I don't actually have a strong conviction about these things. We haven't even spoken about the marketing side. This is like building product side, but like on the marketing side, that's probably one of the first things to get disrupted in terms of like copywriting. And you get this incredibly personalized emails now of like these outbound agents that are just doing stuff like just all around, right? It's like getting good on being able to like prototype these things pretty quickly. When I say prototype, it's still a proper app, right? Like you can take payments and stuff. It's not that difficult anymore, which is amazing. Plus on the marketing side, and then I'm just kind of like, you can just go for it from there. Anyway, we've gone a little bit off topic here, but it does genuinely change everything.
Last question then. Would you do it again? Do you have another startup in you?
Possibly. Circumstances are different. I've got 3 kids now and everything else, so the risk reward calculation is probably a little bit different. But I'm just at this point, I'm just having so much fun building personal apps, which is probably going to become a thing, at least temporarily. Where I just, a very short example of this, like I needed to convert emails into markdown files to feed into an LLM, and I was trying to like look for an email converter, and they all look a little bit like spammy trying to do this stuff. I was like, you know what, it's literally easier for me to build this on Replit. And I did it in 20 minutes, and I built myself like solve my own problem by actually building an app like that. And it's just like that, they're having that sort of default mentality, I think is incredible.
Nice. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Do you want people to reach out to you if they want to find out more about Nozzle, or what should they do?
Yeah, absolutely. You reach out to me, LinkedIn. I'm pretty responsive over there, or rael.cline@nozzle.ai. Probably the 2 best places to reach out.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Cheers.